Okay, here is a piece from Zero Hedge. Are we about to return to the principle that actions have consequences? And this is by James Howard Kunstler via kunstler.com. Now, I don't know if you've seen James on the Greg Hunter show, USA Watchdog, but he's an interesting character, and I certainly like some of the things, some of the points that he brings up. Evidence of absence. What is most perilous for our country now would be to journey through a second epic crisis of authority in recent times without anybody facing the consequences of crimes they may have committed. The result would be a people turn utterly cynical with no faith in their institutions or the rule of law, and no way to imagine a restoration of their lost faith within the bounds of law. It will be a deadly divorce between truth and reality. It will be an invitation to civil violence, a broken social contract, and the end of the framework for American life that was set up in 1778. And how true that is, as we will see, there is plenty of evidence that there is no rule of law as the common people, the working people, know it. The first crisis of the era was the great financial crash of 2008, based on widespread malfeasance in the banking world. An unprecedented suspension of rules, norms and laws. GFC poster boy Angelo Mazzillo, CEO and chairman of Countrywide Financial, a subprime mortgage racketeering outfit, sucked at least $500 million out of his operation before it blew up, and was finally nicked for $67 million in fines by the SEC, partially paid by the company's indemnity insurer, with criminal charges of securities fraud eventually dropped in the janky settlement. In other words, the cost of doing business. Scores of other fraudsters and swindlers in that orgy of banking malfeasance were never marched into a courtroom, never had to answer for their depredations, and remained at their desks in the C-suites collecting extravagant bonuses. The problems they caused were papered over with trillions of dollars that all of us are still on the hook for, and contrary to appearances, the banking system never actually recovered. It is permanently demoralised.
Now we've got austerity. It's pretty bad as well. Things are so bad in Glasgow that mothers have started dressing their children up as referees in the hope that people throw coins at them in the street. And everybody's looking for someone to blame, aren't they? Is it immigrants? Is it people on benefits? It was the fucking banks! They showed you them doing it on the fucking news! Am I the only person that remembers that? Am I going fucking crazy? Do you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of watching Columbo at my granny when I was wee. Columbo, they'd show you the murder in the pre-credit sequence. It wasn't a whodunit. It was about Columbo proving that the guy did it. And then halfway through, my granny'd always go, I think it was her. No, Granny, it was fucking him! They showed you him doing it with a fucking paperweight. It's exactly the same thing with austerity. I think it's those Polish cunts round the corner. It was the fucking banks! The fucking banks!
How it was that Barack Obama came on duty in January of 2009 and got away with doing absolutely nothing about all of that for 8 years remains one of the abiding mysteries of life on Earth. Perhaps getting the first black president into the White House was such an intoxicating triumph of righteousness that nothing else seemed to matter anymore. Perhaps Mr. Obama was just a cat's paw from banksterdom. Sure kinda seems like it when your first two hires are Robert Rubin and Larry Summers. The failure to assign penalties for the massive bad behaviour has set up the nation for another financial fiasco, surely of greater magnitude than the blow-up of 2008, considering the current debt landscape. Not a few astute observers say they feel the hot breath of that monster on the back of their necks lately, with all the strange actions in the repo market, 500 billion liquidity injections in 6 weeks. But now we are a year into Attorney General Bill Barr's coming on the scene. The crime scene of Russiagate and all its deceitful spin-offs. The Mueller investigation revealed itself not just a thumping failure, but part of a broader exercise in bad faith and sedition to first prevent Mr. Trump from winning the 2016 election, and then to harass, obstruct, disable and eject him from office. And 6 months after Mr. Mueller's faceplant, out comes the Horowitz report tracing in spectacular detail further and deeper criminal irregularities in the US justice agencies. What's more, tremendous amounts of evidence for all this already sits on the record in public documents. the timelines are well understood. And so an anxious nausea spreads over the land that Mr. Barr and Mr. Durham are dawdling towards a goal of deflecting justice from the sick institutions behind the 3-year coup. That our polity is so saturated in corruption, nothing will be allowed to clean it up. Personally, I don't subscribe to that hopelessness, and I will say why. But I must also say that if Barr and Durham fail to deliver a bail of indictments, they will be putting a bullet in the head of this republic. There will be no hope of restoring trust in the system, and the hopelessness will inspire serious civil violence. Now, I'll say at this point, the important part about all of this is that this is not pro-Trump and this is not pro-Republican. This is the rule of law that governs both of these parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. They both harp on endlessly about no one being above the law. Well, this is why it is important now to start cleaning up all of these messes so that everybody, when they do wrong or they are brought before the law, that first they can speak for themselves, that they can face their accuser, and that they will pay for their wrongdoings. That is so important in any civilized society. In fact, that is what separates any civilized society from an uncivilized society, and that is a justice system that is beyond reproach. It ought to be obvious that we are well into Strauss and Howe's fourth turning, the generational climax of a grand political cycle tending towards darkness and ruin, and eventually the birth of a new cycle. But the god of history in the making is a prankster. For instance, in the fourth turning, there is the archetypal figure they call the Grey Champion, specifically a baby boomer who emerges as the national leader to turn back the gathering darkness. Well, you order up a Grey Champion and Cosmic Room Service sends you a New York real estate grifter with a 23-word vocabulary, an impulse control problem, and a mystifying hairdo. It becomes extremely difficult to defend this ludicrous character, except that the conduct of his antagonist has been much, much worse, and probably more destructive to the long-running American experiment in liberty. And I would like to remind you that this is an experiment. The way we live is not written in stone, and it is up to us to participate in that. Exactly because the misconduct against Mr. Trump was so deep and broad, bringing actual cases to court will require extreme care, especially if these cases are folded into a RICO rap. Mr. Barr has been surprisingly transparent in his procedures and his motives. He made it quite clear in speeches last fall at Notre Dame and the Federalist Society that he deplores the lawless anarchy of resistance efforts to engage in a war to cripple, by any means necessary, a duly elected government. He stated recently that he expects Mr. Durham to act by late spring. Many are discouraged that he did not bring a case against James Comey on an earlier referral by Investigator General Horowitz in the Hillary email server matter. Mr. Barr averred that it was not the strongest cases against the former FBI chief. I took it to mean that graver charges await and there was no point going through the motions with a weaker Mickey Mouse count, and possibly losing in court. Point taken. We'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, there is the impeachment ceremony, connoting a trial in the Senate to resolve the charges. Just days after it was voted in the House, and in the limbo between Christmas and the New Year, nobody seems to know what will come out of all of that. The President seems eager for a Senate trial. His counsellors would call witnesses until the cows come home, and probably do a great job of humiliating and disarming the rabid forces of the resistance. But hauling in the likes of Brennan, Comey, Strzok, McCabe et al. Might only go to diminish any cases to be brought against them by Mr. Durham. Limiting the witnesses to the Ukraine whistleblower scam that provoked the impeachment, Eric Herrera, Michael Atkinson, Adam Schiff, would be a capital entertainment, but again it might also affect federal cases against them, a necessary corrective in the big picture. On the balance then, whatever happens in the Senate, the briefer the better, and the most obvious tack would be a simple summary dismissal of the House's charges as devoid of merit, and then a season of patience while events are allowed to play out. What's at stake, beyond the fog of concerted deception and bad faith, is whether we return to the principle that actions bring consequences, which is also the basic principle of reality. The departure from that since 2008 has just about wrecked the foundations of this country.